So let me tell you a little bit about what we're about here. As you heard, obviously, we are economists, we're public policy folks. We work for both the public and the private sector. Most of the time when we're working for the private sector, it's around a public issue. And so we do everything from helping people better understand the economic implications of different policy decisions that are in front of them, to looking at, gee, how much sales tax revenue are we going to have next year, to thinking about the kind of things we're going to talk about tonight, which is as you change your form of governance, or at least as you potentially change your form of governance, what are the potential costs? What are potential revenue enhancements? How does it all kind of come together? And so one of the things that Steve said is important. We are doing this as an update to the work that was done 5 years ago by the folks at EPS. This is not a brand new study. It is simply bringing the data forward from that original 2012 baseline up to 2017, which is the current budget year for the township here in the Woodlands. John, go ahead. And so how do you do this? How do you sort of go through this process? Well, there's a version of it that I think is pretty straightforward. We looked at both changes in costs and revenues, and the way we basically did that was to look largely at information from communities that are comparable to the Woodlands. The original study pegged 4. They had McKinney, they had Sugar Land, they had Round Rock, and they had off the top of my head, I can't remember the 4th one. We added Conroe to the mix as well to try to get a more local piece in the equation. But you looked on a per capita basis really at what those cities are paying for different kinds of services. So you looked at things like how much are they paying per capita for police? How much are they paying for fire? And that's sort of a way to say, where were they 5 years ago? Where are they today? It allows you to figure out what the growth has been over the 5-year period. And typically what we would do is we would take an average of those 5 cities. We then also push that against the overall population growth in the Woodlands. So what we're trying to do is to say, look, let's look at the experience of comparable communities, and let's take an average of that, and then let's use that as information we can then extrapolate to the real world of the experience of the Woodlands in terms of population growth. And that helps us figure out things, not only increasing costs, which is what this conversation tends to focus on, but also increasing revenues, because there are some increasing revenues as part of the mix as well. I want to really emphasize that second bullet. I don't think my job in any way, shape, or form is to tell this community or the leadership of this community or anybody else what to do. My job is hopefully to come up with some information that helps you think a little more effectively about what to do. So I am not going to stand up here and say you should incorporate next week, or you should incorporate in 2057, or you should never incorporate. That's not my job. I don't live here. I haven't been asked to weigh in on that. I've been asked to try to help with the analytical basis behind thinking about that decision. Second thing that's related to that, and it's important, I don't assume that there's going to be any changes in state law. There are some constraints right now on what the Woodlands could do with certain of its revenue streams, lodging and hotel occupancy tax in particular, if it became a municipality. I'm not going to assume that you can get an exception from the state of Texas about those kind of constraints. I'm not going to assume any policy decisions. Again, I think that's dangerous because you don't know whether that stuff's going to happen or not. So really it comes down to 2 things, and I touched on it briefly. Operations impact, that's the day-to-day running of the city. What's it cost to have police? What's it going to cost to have fire? What's it going to cost to put in a municipal court system, et cetera, et cetera? And then on the capital cost side, what capital projects have to be undertaken to move the community into being a municipality? And I'll give you a little bit of a preview. Most of it is around transportation, which I think probably all of you knew anyway. John, go ahead. So there's a lot of numbers, and I'm grateful we're doing this in the evening. It's really hard at 8 o'clock in the morning to have these kinds of conversations when people haven't had a drink yet. So hopefully this will go a little bit better. This is taken straight from the study, and it's really just to remind you all, straight from the study that EPS did in 2012, where on the revenue side, they looked at revenues as a township, and then what would change under a municipality. So it's straight from there. You see that the 2 major revenue sources really are the property tax, sales tax. Those were unchanged. EPS at the time said you would lose the 2% surcharge, which the township currently has on the hotel occupancy tax, They then sort of went through several other pieces of the equation. Most of this doesn't change much. You do see some increases in fines and permits and licenses. And so the bottom line is a hair under $8 million in increased revenue in the 2012 study done by EPS. John, go ahead. And so then what are the changes in the operational costs? And by the way, the methodology that EPS went through in terms of looking at peer communities is very similar to what I did. So that is the sort of standard way you would do this. And so you see some significant increases here. You see an increase there from $8.5 million for general government up to a little over $12 million. The big increases really are in police. You see an almost doubling there. And then down in public works as well. Some other increases along the way. The bottom line is an almost $26 million increase for what they did in the past. So costs go up more rapidly than revenues in the 2012 study. John, go ahead. So again, I started off by looking in this study and updating it and saying, okay, let's start with the revenue side of the equation. There's no change from the current revenues in property tax and sales taxes. Those stay the same. Mixed beverage tax, we looked again at an average of peer cities. We couldn't actually get data from McKinney. They didn't break it out very well. So that's an average. You see quite an increase in mixed beverage tax. Again, franchise fees, a similar process. You looked at your average in peer cities. Hotel occupancy tax, as it's set up right now, under state law, you can't use hotel occupancy tax for general fund purposes. It's just not allowed. Editorial opinion on my part, I think that's overly restrictive. And I think, frankly, there are a number of cities around the state, Austin in particular, San Antonio in particular, who would like to see that changed and a little more flexibility introduced to what you can use the proceeds from lodging tax for. Right now, it's basically limited to you can use it to promote tourism and you can use it to pay for cultural arts, and that's about it. You can't use it for police, can't use it for fire. So you lose all that under incorporation. You lose a little bit of your event tax under current state law, again, because there are some restrictions on that. Your permits and licenses and your fines actually go up quite a bit, again, based on the average of your peer cities. Now, that will logically be paid by local residents, but in terms of revenue in the mix, those go up. And so what you end up with is revenues in the original study were projected to increase by about $8 million. In the update, it's more like about 5.5. And the big driver on that is because you can't use the hotel lodging tax. So that's the revenue side of the equation. John, go ahead. And so then this is the operational cost side of the equation. And again, these are based on the net increases. What we did was to try to go to these other cities and narrow in as closely as we could. So if we were talking about police, we tried to use their spending specifically for police. If we had a hard time breaking it out, we would do things such as public safety, which is a broader category. But what you see in most of these is on a per capita basis, 20 to 25% increases, and you combine that with around 12% population growth in the Woodlands over the last 5 years or so, and you're close to a 40% increase in these operating costs. And so the almost $26 million number now is over $36 million 5 years later. John, go ahead. And so on the capital costs, that was the operating cost side of the equation. On the capital costs, again, we had a list here of about $91 million in capital costs identified in the original study. We tried to find a basis to grow these. The biggest one is the road maintenance number. You can see that's the lion's share of what we're talking about here. TxDOT, the state highway department, maintains a highway cost index. That's a measure of highway development, if you will, inflation. That grew by almost 44% in that 5-year period. So we use that to inflate that big number. Bottom line is the capital costs go from 91 odd million to over 127 million. Interestingly, however, 5 years ago, if you were going to do that as a bond package, you'd have been paying close to 5% in interest rates. 4.75 was the assumption. Today, the number's more like 3. So it's actually a more attractive financing environment. Assuming you do 30 years worth of debt, you have a little bit of cost of issuance in there, you're looking at annual debt service that goes from about $5.8 million up to about 6.9. John, go ahead. So how does that all come together? What is the results? What does that mean? Well, you have an operating cost shortfall of about $31 million per what I showed you before, and you need just under $7 million in annual debt service. So you're talking about all in about $38 million in shortfall right now. Sales tax is already at the state legislated maximum. It's already as high as it can go. Realistically, the only source of revenue, the only real lever you can pull to meet that shortfall would be to increase the property tax rate. In your current budget right now, your current tax rate at 23 cents yields just under $2 million per penny of tax effort. So if you take that just under $2 million number and divide it into that $38 million number, what you get is a theoretical property tax increase of a little over 19 cents per $100 of assessed valuation. That's 85% or so higher than the current rate of 23 cents. And so it would give you a blended rate. That theoretical increase plus the existing tax rate would give you a theoretical rate of about 42.5 cents per $100 of assessed valuation. Show you a chart, that puts you squarely in the middle of your peer community set. John, go ahead. And so again, Frisco, that's the one I couldn't remember. You look at the current tax rates for these cities. You got Sugar Land over there on the left, Frisco, Conroe, McKinney, Round Rock, and then the Woodlands. Your current rate is 23 cents. When you add that 19 cents or so on top of it, you're at 42.6. That's pretty consistent with the other communities that you are, your peer group. I tried to find another city of any size that has a lower tax rate right now than the Woodlands. The closest I can come is Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg is not directly comparable to the Woodlands. It's a different community. Their current tax rate is 2.2313. So they are, if I'm going to do this right, 13 1,000ths higher than you are. This is more like what is typical for rapidly growing communities that are on the edges of major urban areas. And so again, I think it's pretty straightforward. There are some outliers, but again, this sort of 40-cent range is about what we'd be talking about. John, go ahead. So the conclusions, one of the things that's really impressive, and I say this as an outsider, is that you have a very high level of basic services and amenities here at a price, i.e. your tax burden, that's pretty competitive. And it's competitive. A big part of what we do is it has an economic development focus. It is a sales point for sure for this community to both residents and to commercial folks that the relative tax burden here is pretty attractive. No doubt about it. That's a strong competitive advantage in my opinion. Typically what happens if you get incorporation, every municipality both regulates and provides services, right? They do ordinances, they provide municipal services. Right now, I would say my outside opinion is you're fairly light on regulation, fairly heavy on the service side. That balance might shift a little bit along the way. That isn't good or bad, that just is what it is. Have new powers, new requirements, and again, per what we said, probably increased cost. And so I think what will happen if you moved to incorporation, and all these numbers came true, is you would lose a little bit of that competitive advantage in comparison to your peer cities. Is that good? Is that bad? Not for me to say. I mean, the price, this is reasonably close to the price. The question then becomes, is that the price you want to pay? That's up to you guys.